The storm hit faster than Savannah could have ever expected. 1 minute, she was driving along the winding mountain road, trying to outrun the dark clouds rolling in over the trees. The next, sheets of rain hammered against her windshield, making it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. When a flash of lightning struck a tree just yards away, sending branches crashing onto the road, she knew she was stuck. Her hands trembled as she pulled her car to the side of the road. She was miles from the nearest town, her phone had no service, and the temperature was dropping fast. Panic clawed at her chest until she spotted it. A cabin. It was tucked between towering pines, barely visible through the storm, but it was her only option. Grabbing her coat, she bolted from the car, her boots sinking into the mud as she sprinted toward the front door. The wind howled around her as she pounded on the wooden surface. "Hello?" she called, her voice barely audible over the storm. No answer. She hesitated for only a moment before trying the handle. To her relief, it turned easily. The door creaked open, revealing a dimly lit but undeniably warm interior. A fire burned low in the stone fireplace, casting flickering shadows across a room filled with dark wood furniture and thick blankets. She stepped inside, dripping water onto the hardwood floor. "Hello?" she tried again. Still nothing. Maybe whoever lived here had left before the storm hit. Either way, she couldn't go back outside. Closing the door behind her, she peeled off her soaked coat and tiptoed toward the fire, holding her hands out toward the warmth. She barely had a chance to relax before a deep voice sliced through the silence. "Who the hell are you?" She whirled around. A man stood in the doorway of what must have been a bedroom, his piercing blue eyes locked onto her. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and wearing nothing but a pair of dark sweatpants. His damp hair was tousled, and there was an edge of danger in his sharp gaze. Savannah swallowed hard. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to break in. There was a storm, and my car." His gaze flickered toward the window, as if just noticing the raging storm outside. His jaw tightened. "You just walked in." "The door was open," she said quickly. "I was going to leave as soon as the storm passed." For a long moment he just stared at her. The firelight cast sharp shadows across his chiseled features, making him look even more intimidating. Then, with a heavy sigh, he ran a hand through his hair and muttered, "You're lucky I don't shoot first and ask questions later." Savannah tensed. "I swear, I'm not here to steal anything. I just needed shelter." He studied her for another few agonizing seconds before nodding toward the couch. "Sit. You're shivering." She hesitated, then slowly lowered herself onto the couch, her soaked clothes clinging to her skin. The man disappeared into the other room and returned a minute later with a thick gray hoodie. He tossed it toward her. "Wear this before you freeze to death." She caught it, surprised by the unexpected kindness. "Thank you." He didn't respond. Instead, he grabbed a towel and ran it over his damp hair before dropping into the armchair across from her. Now that she was no longer panicking, she took a moment to really look at him. He had the rough, rugged look of someone who didn't care for appearances but somehow still looked devastatingly attractive. His sharp features, strong jawline, and piercing blue eyes made it impossible to look away. "So, are you going to tell me your name, or should I just call you Intruder?" he asked, his voice laced with amusement. Savannah straightened. "Savannah." He nodded. "Yale." "Yale?" she repeated. "Like the university?" His lips twitched. "Like my name." She felt heat rush to her cheeks. "Right. Well, Yale, I really appreciate you letting me stay until the storm passes. I'll be out of your hair as soon as I can." He leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms over his chest. "Storm like this? You're not going anywhere until morning." Her stomach twisted. "Oh." He raised an eyebrow. "That a problem?" "No, I just..." She hesitated, then sighed. "I didn't exactly plan on spending the night in a stranger's cabin." He let out a low chuckle. "Yeah, well, I didn't plan on finding a stranger sitting in my living room either." Despite herself, she smiled. Fair enough. For a while, they sat in silence, the crackling fire the only sound between them. Savannah could still hear the wind howling outside, but inside the cabin, it felt strangely safe. Yale got up and disappeared into the kitchen, returning a few minutes later with 2 steaming mugs. He handed one to her without a word. She took it hesitantly, the warmth seeping into her frozen hands. What is it? Tea. Figured you could use it. She took a cautious sip, surprised by how good it tasted. Thank you. He just grunted and took a seat again. Savannah studied him over the rim of her mug. There was something about him, something unreadable. He didn't seem like the kind of guy who had visitors often, and yet he hadn't thrown her out into the storm. So, she ventured, do you live here full time? He hesitated. Sometimes. Alone? His gaze flickered toward the fire. Yeah. She frowned. That must get lonely. He didn't respond right away. Then, in a low voice, he said, sometimes, that's the point. Something in his tone made her chest tighten. She didn't know what had driven him to live in a cabin in the middle of nowhere, but she had a feeling there was more to Yale than he let on. As the storm raged outside, Savannah couldn't shake the feeling that this night, this unexpected encounter, was going to change everything. The storm raged on through the night, rain hammering against the cabin's roof in an erratic rhythm. Savannah remained curled up on the couch, the borrowed hoodie swallowing her frame. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, casting long shadows across the room. Yale sat in the armchair, eyes fixed on the flames, his expression unreadable. Either of them spoke for a long time. The weight of the situation settled between them like an unspoken understanding, 2 strangers forced together by circumstance, yet bound by an odd sense of trust. Savannah shifted slightly, the warmth of the tea Yale had given her still lingering in her hands. She hesitated before breaking the silence. You don't seem surprised to find someone out here in the middle of nowhere. He exhaled, his gaze flickering toward her. You're the first. That answer only deepened her curiosity. Then why didn't you just tell me to leave? His jaw tightened slightly, as if debating how much to say. Because no one should be out in a storm like this. And... He paused, running a hand over his face before adding, I'm not heartless. She studied him carefully, noting the way his shoulders remained tense, as if he carried a weight he refused to acknowledge. There was something raw beneath his controlled demeanor, something she couldn't quite place. Instead of prying, she glanced toward the window, where the storm showed no sign of letting up. Looks like I really am stuck here for the night. Yale didn't respond immediately, but after a long moment he stood. You should get some rest. He nodded toward the couch. I'll grab a blanket. Savannah opened her mouth to protest, but he had already disappeared into the back of the cabin. When he returned, he tossed a thick wool blanket onto the couch beside her. What about you? She asked, glancing toward the armchair. I'll be fine. Something about the way he said it made her think this wasn't the first time he'd spent a night alone in that chair. She hesitated before pulling the blanket over her legs. Thank you, Yale. His expression remained unreadable, but he gave a slight nod before extinguishing the last of the lanterns, plunging the cabin into darkness save for the faint glow of the embers. Savannah closed her eyes, the exhaustion from the day finally catching up to her. But even as sleep tugged at her, her mind lingered on the man sitting just a few feet away, the stranger who had given her warmth, shelter, and an unexpected glimpse into a life far more complicated than he let on. The morning came with startling quiet. Gone was the relentless downpour, replaced by the soft chirping of birds and the golden light filtering through the trees. Savannah stirred, blinking against the sunlight streaming through the window. She stretched, momentarily disoriented, before the events of the previous night came rushing back. The cabin. The storm. Yale. She turned her head, expecting to see him still in the armchair, but he was gone. A faint clatter from the kitchen told her he was awake. Pushing the blanket aside, she stood, smoothing down her wrinkled clothes before making her way toward the sound. Yale stood at the stove, the scent of coffee and something slightly sweet filling the air. The sight was almost jarring, this rugged, reclusive man effortlessly moving through the kitchen, his movements precise and unhurried. He glanced at her as she entered. "You sleep?" She nodded, though she wasn't entirely sure how well. "You?" He shrugged, pouring coffee into a mug before sliding it across the counter toward her. "Better than usual." It was a simple statement, but something about it made her pause. She wrapped her hands around the mug, savoring the warmth. "I guess I should check the roads soon." Yale didn't respond immediately. Instead, he turned off the stove and set a plate of toast and fruit on the counter between them. "Eat first." She blinked at the unexpected gesture. "You didn't have to. Just eat." There was no sharpness in his tone, just quiet insistence. She sat down, the meal simple but surprisingly comforting. They ate mostly in silence, though the quiet between them no longer felt as heavy as the night before. When she finally set her mug down, she met his gaze. "Why do you live out here?" Yale leaned against the counter, arms folded. "Not a fan of people." Savannah arched a brow. "That's it." His lips pressed together, as if debating whether to say more. Then, with a sigh, he admitted, "Sometimes it's easier to be alone." She studied him for a long moment, sensing there was far more to that answer than he was willing to share. But she didn't push. Instead, she glanced toward the window. "I should probably see if my car still works." Yale gave a slow nod. "I'll walk you down." They stepped outside together, the crisp morning air a stark contrast to the storm's chaos. Savannah's car sat where she had left it, mud splattered along the tires but otherwise intact. She pulled out her keys, testing the ignition. The engine sputtered before finally turning over. Relief flooded her. Turning to Yale, she hesitated. "Thank you?" "For everything." He simply nodded, his expression unreadable. She hesitated, something about leaving feeling wrong. Finally, she forced a small smile. "Goodbye, Yale." He didn't say goodbye. Instead, he simply watched as she drove away, the reflection of the morning sun casting long shadows over the cabin behind him. As Savannah made her way back to town, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was leaving something unfinished. And deep down, she knew this wasn't the last time she would see Yale. Savannah had told herself she wouldn't think about Yale after she left the cabin. She had convinced herself that he was just a fleeting moment in a chaotic night, a stranger who had shown her unexpected kindness before fading back into the wilderness. But as the days passed, her mind betrayed her. She caught herself glancing out her apartment window, imagining the dense trees surrounding his cabin. She found herself pausing in the middle of her shifts at the cafe, remembering the way his voice had sounded in the quiet glow of the fire. And at night, when she closed her eyes, she could still feel the warmth of the hoodie he had given her, the scent of pine, and something distinctly him lingering in her memory. It was ridiculous. She didn't even know him. Yet something about Yale had burrowed deep into her thoughts, refusing to let go. It wasn't just the way he had helped her, it was the way he had looked at her, like he wasn't used to company but hadn't minded hers. It was the way he had spoken, every word careful, guarded, as though he was holding back an entire world of secrets. And Savannah had always been terrible at leaving mysteries unsolved. So when the first snowfall of the season dusted the mountain roads, she found herself gripping her steering wheel, heading back toward the place she had sworn she wouldn't return to. The drive felt longer this time, the trees stretching endlessly on either side of her. But when she reached the familiar turnoff, her pulse quickened. The cabin stood just as she had left it, nestled between towering pines, smoke curling from the chimney. A truck she hadn't noticed before was parked beside it, sleek, black, and oddly out of place in the rustic setting. Savannah hesitated. This was a mistake. She had no reason to be here. But before she could turn back, the door swung open. Yale stepped onto the porch, a thick sweater replacing the bare skin she had seen last time. His expression was unreadable as he rested a hand on the railing, watching her with something that almost resembled amusement. "You lost again?" She swallowed, gripping the steering wheel. "No. He tilted his head slightly, waiting. She exhaled. I wanted to check on you. A flicker of something passed through his eyes, surprise, maybe. But it was gone almost instantly. You drove all the way up here for that? She hesitated, then nodded. Yale was quiet for a long moment before he stepped aside, nodding toward the door. Might as well come in. Savannah didn't need to be told twice. The warmth of the cabin enveloped her as she stepped inside, the scent of burning wood filling the space. It was exactly as she remembered, cozy, untouched by time, as if the outside world had no place here. Yale moved toward the fireplace, adding another log to the flames. You always show up uninvited? His tone wasn't harsh, but there was a teasing edge to it. Savannah crossed her arms. You always live in the middle of nowhere? That earned a quiet chuckle, the sound low and unexpected. I like the quiet, he admitted. She studied him in the glow of the fire. And yet you didn't tell me to leave. Yale leaned against the stone mantel, meeting her gaze. No. I didn't. Something unspoken passed between them, then an acknowledgement that neither of them quite understood why she was here, but neither of them wanted her to leave just yet. Savannah glanced around, her eyes landing on a thick, leather-bound book resting on the coffee table. She picked it up, flipping through the pages. You read philosophy? She mused, glancing at the highlighted passages. Yale shrugged. Sometimes. She arched a brow. Didn't peg you for the deep-thinking type? He smirked. And what type did you peg me for? Savannah hesitated, then answered honestly. The type who doesn't let people in. Yale's expression didn't change, but something in his posture stiffened slightly. People tend to disappoint, he said after a moment. Savannah set the book down, meeting his gaze. Not everyone. His lips pressed into a thin line, as if he wasn't sure he believed that. She didn't push. Instead, she turned toward the kitchen, where a bottle of whiskey sat on the counter. She raised a brow. Drinking alone? Yale followed her gaze. Only when necessary. Savannah rolled her eyes. That sounds dramatic. He walked past her, grabbing 2 glasses. Maybe. She watched as he poured them both a drink, handing her one without asking if she wanted it. She took a sip, the warmth spreading through her instantly. They stood there, 2 strangers who weren't quite strangers anymore, the snow falling silently beyond the windows. Yale spoke first. You ever think about leaving? Savannah frowned. Leaving where? The town. Starting over somewhere else. She considered that. I used to. And now? She exhaled. Now I don't know. I guess I'm still trying to figure out where I belong. Yale studied her for a long moment before nodding, as if he understood that feeling all too well. Savannah set her glass down, her fingers tracing the rim. And you? Why are you really out here? He didn't answer right away. Instead, he took a slow sip of his drink before finally saying, because sometimes, disappearing is easier than being found. Savannah's breath caught at the weight of his words. She wanted to ask more, to press him for details, for the truth beneath his guarded exterior. But something told her Yale didn't give away pieces of himself easily. So instead, she simply said, I don't think you're as invisible as you think you are. Yale's gaze flickered to hers, something unreadable in his expression. For the first time, Savannah wondered if maybe, just maybe, she had been meant to find him after all. Savannah wasn't sure when the shift happened, when the quiet tension between her and Yale turned into something deeper, something undeniable. Maybe it was the moment she returned to the cabin, standing in the snow, as if drawn back by an unseen force. Maybe it had been the night of the storm, when she had first seen the way he looked at her, not just with curiosity, but with something else, something he tried to keep buried. But she felt it now, thick in the air between them. She set her empty glass down on the counter as the fire crackled behind them, casting a golden glow over the space. Yale leaned against the edge of the kitchen island, his fingers curled loosely around his own drink. His blue eyes stayed on her, unreadable yet intent. Savannah's pulse quickened. She wasn't delusional, she knew attraction when she felt it. But with Yale, it was different. It wasn't just the way he looked at her, or the way her skin warmed whenever he stood too close. It was the way he made her feel like she was stepping into something unknown, something thrilling but dangerous all the same. "Why did you really come back?" Yale's voice was low, but there was something in it, something that told her he already knew the answer but wanted to hear her say it. Savannah's breath hitched, her fingers tightening against the wood of the counter. There were 100 ways she could answer. 100 excuses she could give. But none of them would be true. So, instead, she took a step closer. The space between them shrank, and she saw the way Yale's jaw tensed, the way his fingers twitched against the glass as if resisting the urge to reach for her. "I don't know," she admitted, voice barely above a whisper. "But I couldn't stop thinking about you." Yale exhaled sharply, as if her words had struck something deep within him. For a moment, neither of them moved. The air was thick and charged, the silence stretching between them like a delicate thread about to snap. Then, finally, Yale set his glass down. And in the next breath, he was in front of her. Savannah barely had time to react before his hand brushed against her jaw, fingers trailing lightly against her skin. The touch sent a shiver down her spine, her body instinctively leaning into him. His gaze searched hers, a silent question lingering between them. She answered by tilting her chin up, closing the last of the space between them. The kiss was slow at first, hesitant, as if they were both testing the waters of something neither of them were ready to name. But then, something shifted. Yale's hand slid to the back of her neck, pulling her closer as his lips moved against hers with more urgency. Savannah's fingers curled into the fabric of his sweater, anchoring herself as warmth spread through her. It was unlike anything she had ever felt before, like standing on the edge of something vast and endless, knowing that one step forward would change everything. And she wanted to take that step. When they finally pulled apart, their breaths mingling in the space between them, Yale rested his forehead against hers. A silence stretched between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. If anything, it was full of everything they weren't saying, everything that had been building between them since the moment she had stumbled into his cabin. Savannah let out a shaky breath, her fingers still curled in his sweater. "I don't know what this is," she murmured. Yale's lips ghosted over her temple, his breath warm against her skin. "Neither do I." But neither of them moved away. Instead, Yale took her hand, intertwining their fingers before leading her toward the couch. They sank into the cushions together, the fire casting flickering shadows along the walls. Savannah rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. And she had a feeling Yale felt the same. The following days passed in a blur of stolen moments and whispered confessions. Savannah never officially decided to stay, but she never left either. She woke each morning to the scent of coffee and the distant sound of Yale chopping wood outside. Afternoons were spent walking through the snow-covered forest, learning pieces of each other in quiet conversations. And at night they sat by the fire, wrapped in blankets and each other, as if the rest of the world didn't exist. It was easy. Too easy. And that's what scared Savannah the most. Because easy didn't last. One evening, as she stood by the window, watching the snow fall, Yale came up behind her. His arms wrapped around her waist, pulling her back against his chest. She leaned into him instinctively. But the thought still nagged at her, the quiet, persistent voice reminding her that this wasn't real life. "What happens when this ends?" she asked softly. Yale stiffened behind her. After a long moment, he turned her around to face him, his hands resting on her hips. His gaze was intense, unwavering. "Who says it has to end?" Savannah swallowed, her heart pounding. "You live in the middle of nowhere," she said. "I have a life down in town. A job. Responsibilities. This isn't the real world." Yale's jaw tightened. "Are you saying you don't want this?" She hesitated. That was the problem, she did want this. She wanted him. But she was terrified that wanting wouldn't be enough. "I'm saying I don't know how this works," she admitted. Yale exhaled, his thumb brushing lightly against her hip. "Then let's figure it out together." Savannah searched his gaze, looking for hesitation, for doubt. But there was none. Just certainty. And for the first time, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, this didn't have to be temporary. That maybe love, true, unexpected, all-consuming love, was something worth fighting for. So, she took a deep breath. And she chose to stay. Savannah hadn't expected to stay forever. She had told herself it was temporary, a few days, maybe a week at most. But days stretched into weeks, and soon, the idea of leaving felt impossible. The cabin had become something more than a refuge from a storm. It had become a place where time slowed, where the noise of the outside world dulled into irrelevance. The crackling of the fire at night, the crisp scent of pine in the morning air, the quiet moments when Yale would reach for her hand without a word, it was all grounding, intoxicating in a way she hadn't anticipated. But the real surprise wasn't the cabin. It was Yale. He had started to let her in, piece by piece. He never revealed everything at once, but in stolen moments, while chopping wood, while brewing coffee, while sitting beside her on the worn leather couch, he shared fragments of his life. And those fragments painted a picture she never could have expected. She had assumed he was just a man who had chosen to live in isolation. But there was more to it. One evening, as the sky burned orange with the setting sun, she found him by the lake that sat just beyond the cabin. He stood at the water's edge, hands in his pockets, staring at the reflection of the sky rippling across the surface. She approached slowly, feeling the weight of unspoken words in the air. "You don't just live out here for the quiet, do you?" she asked. Yale didn't look away from the water. "No." Savannah waited, giving him space to speak on his own terms. Eventually, he exhaled. "I used to run a company." The admission was unexpected, but she didn't interrupt. "A big company," he added. "Technology. Investments. I built it from nothing." Savannah's breath hitched slightly. He had never once mentioned anything about his past, let alone something like this. "And then?" she prompted. Yale's jaw tightened. "And then I walked away." She studied his profile, the hard set of his expression, the tension in his shoulders. "Why?" For a long time, he didn't answer. Then, finally, he turned to face her, his blue eyes darker than usual. "Because I was becoming someone I didn't want to be." Savannah's heart clenched. He didn't elaborate, but she could sense the weight of whatever had driven him to leave behind a world most people would fight to be a part of. She had thought he was just a quiet man with a guarded past. But now, she realized he was something else entirely. A man who had built an empire only to abandon it. A man who had chosen solitude over power. A man who had fallen for her, despite every instinct telling him not to. And she had fallen for him, too. That night, as they lay in bed with the fire casting golden light across the room, Savannah traced lazy patterns against Yale's forearm. "Do you regret it?" she asked softly. He was quiet for a moment before shaking his head. "No." His voice was steady. "But for the first time, I'm wondering if I made the right choice." Savannah shifted, propping herself up on one elbow. "What do you mean?" He reached up, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "I was convinced I didn't need anyone. That I was better off alone." He let out a slow breath. "And then you showed up." Her heart pounded. She placed a hand against his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her palm. "I didn't plan on staying," she admitted. "I know. But I don't want to leave." The corner of his mouth lifted slightly, but there was something serious in his expression. "You don't have to." Savannah swallowed. "You'd really be okay with that?" Yale's fingers curled around hers, his grip firm, reassuring. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." And that was the moment she knew this wasn't just some fleeting romance. This was real. This was forever. The next morning, Savannah sat on the porch, watching as Yale loaded firewood into the truck. She hadn't been inside the vehicle before, but as he opened the door, her eyes caught something, a sleek leather briefcase resting on the passenger seat. Curious, she stood and walked over. "Do you still handle business out here?" she asked, nodding toward the briefcase. Yale glanced at it before shrugging. "Not really. Just some investments. I don't interfere much anymore." Savannah arched a brow. "So, you're still technically a millionaire?" Yale leaned against the truck, folding his arms. "Does it matter?" She considered that for a moment before shaking her head. "No." Yale reached out, tugging her closer until she was standing between him and the truck. "Good," he murmured. "Because I'd rather you loved me for the man I am here, not the man I used to be." Savannah smiled, threading her fingers through his. "I do." And she meant it. Later that evening, as the first snowfall of the season dusted the trees, Yale pulled her into his arms by the fire. He rested his chin on top of her head, holding her close. "Stay," he murmured against her hair. Savannah closed her eyes, sinking into his warmth. "I already have." The world outside the cabin remained untouched by time, but something between them had shifted permanently. Savannah hadn't left, and Yale hadn't asked her to. There was no need for spoken promises or declarations. Every day, every moment they spent together, made it clear that neither of them wanted this to end. But the weight of reality loomed in the distance, waiting for them to acknowledge it. Savannah had a life down in town, a job, responsibilities. She hadn't walked away from it, but she also hadn't made a decision about what came next. And Yale, he had built an empire only to abandon it, but now, for the first time, he seemed to be reconsidering what he had left behind. One afternoon, as she stood by the lake watching the reflection of the sky ripple across the surface, she heard his footsteps approach behind her. He didn't say anything at first, just slid his hands into his pockets and stood beside her, gazing out over the water. She turned to face him. "Tell me the truth. Do you ever think about going back?" His jaw tightened slightly, and for a moment he didn't answer. Then, with a slow breath, he said, "I walked away because I didn't like who I was becoming." Savannah nodded. "But have you ever thought that maybe you could go back and do it differently this time?" His gaze met hers, something unreadable in his expression. "I don't know if I want that life again," he admitted. "But I know I want you." Her heartbeat quickened. "What if we don't have to choose?" she asked. Yale studied her carefully. "What are you saying?" She hesitated, then took a steadying breath. "You left everything behind because you thought you had to. But what if you could have both? A life that you control on your terms but without shutting out the rest of the world?" He was quiet for a long moment, his eyes searching hers. Then, slowly, he exhaled. "I never considered that," he admitted. Savannah reached for his hand, threading her fingers through his. "Then maybe it's time you did." They stood there for a while, the wind stirring the surface of the lake, the air crisp with the promise of change. Later that evening, as they sat by the fire, Yale leaned back against the couch, his fingers tracing absent circles against her wrist. "You love your job." It wasn't a question, it was a fact. Savannah nodded. "I do. And you wouldn't want to leave it forever." She hesitated before shaking her head. "No, I wouldn't." Yale studied her carefully before speaking again. "Then let's figure out a way to make this work." Savannah's breath caught. "You mean it?" His grip tightened slightly around her hand. "I don't want to be the reason you give up something you love. And I don't want to lose you." A warmth spread through her chest, deep and certain. "Then we'll figure it out," she said. And for the first time, she truly believed they would. A month later, Savannah stood in the middle of a sleek office in the city, the floor-to-ceiling windows offering a breathtaking view of the skyline. She turned to Yale, who stood beside her, his hands in his pockets, his gaze sweeping over the space. "You sure about this?" she asked. He glanced at her, a slow smile tugging at his lips. "I wouldn't be here if I wasn't." After weeks of conversations and decisions, they had come to an agreement. Yale wouldn't return to the corporate world in the way he had before, but he also wouldn't disappear from it entirely. Instead, he had taken a step back into the industry on his own terms, investing in projects that mattered to him, running things remotely when he wanted to, and staying out of the spotlight. And Savannah, she had kept her job in town but had restructured her schedule, splitting her time between the city and the cabin. It was unconventional, but it worked. Because at the end of the day, they had chosen each other. As they stood in the office, the city buzzing below them, Yale reached for her hand. "This is just the beginning," he said. Savannah smiled. "I know." And she couldn't wait for whatever came next. A year later, the cabin was no longer just Yale's retreat, it was their home. They still divided their time between the city and the mountains, but every time they returned to the cabin, it felt like stepping into something sacred, something just for them. On a crisp autumn morning, Savannah stood on the porch, a warm mug in her hands, watching as Yale stacked firewood near the side of the house. He glanced up, catching her gaze, and a familiar warmth spread through her chest. She walked down the steps, crossing the yard to where he stood. Without a word, she slipped her arms around his waist, pressing her cheek against his shoulder. He set the wood down and turned to face her, wrapping his arms around her in return. "You happy?" he murmured. Savannah tilted her head up, meeting his gaze. "Happier than I ever thought I could be." And she was. Because she hadn't just found love, she had found a life she never wanted to leave. And this time, it was forever.